The Liberal Party was originally formed by the amalgamation of several unrelated factions, most notably the Whigs and the Radicals. The Whigs were an aristocratic party formed in the 17th century, whose central motivation was to oppose absolute monarchy and to support a constitutional one with power vested in the Parliament instead of the ruler. Given their initial opposition to the Catholic Stuart claims to the throne, their opposition to any rights being granted to Catholics was also initially a core policy. The main opposition to them at the time were the Tories, who were strongly supportive of the Crown, even if the King were to be Catholic. They were nevertheless also strongly supportive of the Church of England, which held a tight rein over religious dissenters, whether they be Protestant or otherwise. For many years, Tories and Whigs opposed each other in Parliament, with clashes coming to a head in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, when Catholic King James II was deposed by his otherwise loyal Parliament, who were opposed to his promoting the interests of Catholics and Protestant nonconformists within the realm. His replacement, in a coup d'etat that installed his daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William of Orange, ushered in not only a renewed surge of Anglican power and anti-Catholic sentiment, but also bolstered the power of Parliament as the ultimate authority. Despite their differences, both the Tories and Whigs could in essence be described as conservative in outlook, but by the early 1800s they both came under increasing criticism by a loose coalition of parliamentary reformers that were known as radicals. The radicals lacked a unifying ideological base, leadership or internal structure, but they were unified in their views that the current state of politics was entirely in the hands of the aristocracy, with little consideration for the common population. Some radicals advocated for broader voting rights. Some had an anti-slavery agenda, while others were for granting home rule in Ireland and religious tolerance in general, while others were for low taxes, freedom of the press, poverty relief, and anti-protectionism. By the mid-1800s, the Whigs had come to associate themselves increasingly with wealthy industrialists who, by the very nature of their business focus, pushed for free trade and international cooperation. Efficient industrialization increasingly made the institution of chattel slavery redundant, and the Whigs had by now also largely reversed their staunchly anti-Catholic position. After all, why have an enemy when you can have a customer? This notion of consumer economics also influenced their thinking on welfare and prosperity, because if you're poor, you can't buy stuff. By 1859, this more socially progressive element within the Whigs saw them merge with many radical parliamentarians to form the Liberal Party. Now, at the time, only 3% of the adult population in Britain was eligible to vote, but Whig agitation in Parliament in the post-Napoleonic era saw an expansion of the electorate to 6%, effectively doubled, with an expanding urban middle class, and voters eventually included working-class men over 21, not just the landed gentry who previously controlled the votes of entire boroughs. This opened the way for even greater reforms benefiting the working poor, such that the Liberal Party, benefiting from the flush of sympathetic working-class voters, dominated elections right into the early 20th century, and implemented sweeping reforms on education, tenancy laws, religious discrimination, workplace safety, wages and working hours that have continued to form the bedrock of Western society ever since. But by the turn of the century, many disparate elements within the party saw it eventually fracture, while the Tories, now increasingly feeling the need to cater to a new class of voter, themselves began to soften their stance on many previously hardline issues, such that they too moved to a much more moderate, though still conservative position. Large numbers of Liberals who were opposed to excessive government intervention eventually abandoned the party to rejoin this more centre-right Tory party, which eventually morphed into the modern Conservative Party. It was now composed not only of the upper classes, but more broadly commoners of the middle class, including shopkeepers, businessmen and professionals. The more radical elements within the Liberals also abandoned them to form workers' parties such as the Labour Party, leaving the eviscerated Liberal centre a mere shadow of its previous self. This merging and fracturing of frequently opposing ideological elements is why the Liberal Party, in some countries like Australia, sit on the conservative side of politics with what might be referred to as a classical liberal agenda, while in others, such as the United States, they sit on the socialist left in what can be regarded as social liberalism. But in the UK, where the Conservative Party essentially absorbed all the classical liberal elements, the Liberal Party itself ceased to exist as a distinct entity, with its several subsequent reincarnations being of little ongoing political consequence.